We've just arrived at Weir's Point, or Weir Point. Captain Thomas Weir of D Company. He comes up here to this spot without orders. After about an hour or so, while they were down at the Reno-Benteen siege location, Thomas Weir is just like, I can't handle this anymore. I can hear the gunfire. We got to see what's happening to Custer. Maybe if we come up to this spot, we can get an eye on him. And sure enough, he comes up here, Thomas Weir, and they see from here Custer's last stand, basically. They basically witnessed the end of Custer's last stand from this point here. More officers come up here to look, and all they can see is smoke and dust and hundreds of Indians that have surrounded Custer's position and are basically finishing everybody off. After a while, all those Indians come back and they charge this point right here, this hilltop. And so Thomas Weir and everybody else, all the officers, they retreat. They make a big retreat back to the siege location, and that's where they'll spend the remainder of their time here at the Bighorn until they're saved by Alfred Terry. Man. So I need to talk about this guy here, Vincent Charles. Looks like he was a farrier. And this grave is right next to the turnout on the auto tour of where you see, allegedly, Custer sees Reno's charge from that ridge. But that grave is there because when the officers retreated from Weir Point to head back to where Reno was, towards the siege, Reno and Benteen, this Vincent Charles guy, they're getting charged by about 4,000 to 5,000 warriors on horseback screaming. So they're making a retreat. The warriors are spread out a number of distance from this location, so there's bullets being shot at them, and they're doing a rear guard action to get back to where Reno and Benteen are. This Vincent Charles guy was shot through the hips and pitched from his mount, fell down, and he couldn't move because he had been shot through the hips. And as the men were stampeding past him to try to seek refuge, he begs them, please don't leave me behind. Kind of a very similar Benny Hodgson situation. Don't leave me behind. And in that moment, they couldn't really help him out. So they said, just find a place to seek cover and we'll come back for you. And so they take off, and as they look back behind them, they see the Indians finishing off Vincent Charlie. So kind of a sad deal. I guess he was fairly young, so worth mentioning. If you go to the park and look at that grave, just know that guy didn't have a happy ending. Because they heard what was going on, they can hear the gunfire, and after Reno's charge, he was in shock. Everybody was in shock because they had lost a ton of guys down there in that bottom at that very first opening salvo of the fight. And so from here, they sat around basically scratching their heads on where Custer was, and then they started to make excuses like, well, we didn't get any orders. There's been no courier, that's brought over any orders from Custer over there. All they can hear is roaring gunfire. So after the battle, there was a lot of inquiry, court-martial. It was a huge thing that happened after this battle because the whole nation found out about it. And they found out about it on like the 50th anniversary year of the country. And Custer was looked at like a hero because he was a hero in the Union Army during the Civil War as a 23-year-old general. I think one of the youngest generals to ever get brigadier general at 23 years old was Custer. So that's why people liked Custer. He was just like a military hero. And at the time, there was not much sports, there wasn't any sports to really for people to idolize at that time. And so Custer would have been a hero in the minds of a lot of Americans over on the East Coast, whose families hadn't settled out here. And all they're hearing about is, ooh, they're fighting savages out here, And so that you can imagine the imagination that would spur in young people's minds and in the minds of everybody all over the world. That's why this battle is such a wonder. is because it incites those imaginations of such an epic battle, in which it was, but it wasn't a glorious battle. It was a terrible glory. So that's a book by James Donovan, in which that's the book that I've read in order to know about what happened here. So if you get a chance, I'll put the title of the book in the video so you can download it and you can listen to it on Audible, and it will tell you what happened here. And when you know, you look at things a lot differently when you come up here. You realize what happened, and it is just insane. Okay, so we're gonna move on. We're gonna get out of here, and this is also where Benteen and everybody were rescued. So after about 3 days or however long it took, long enough, that's when General Alfred Terry would have come up here with his whole entire command and rescue the survivors of the Little Bighorn, who didn't even engage with Custer over on the other side. They were just here fighting him off until they were rescued by Alfred Terry and taken back to the Yellowstone and then back to North Dakota, where the dispatch news was brought to the country. What a show that happened up here. I can only imagine. People were hungry probably. I mean, they were thirsty though. That was what was said in the book. I mean, you're talking like it's hot, you know, it's really hot, and they're constantly thinking they're gonna die at any second while they're getting picked off by the Indians that were all circled around them, and they had to wait for so long, and they never knew. They didn't know that they were going to get rescued. They just didn't know what they were going to do. It was Frederick Benteen that actually spurred the morale of everybody to keep things going. They should have given Benteen a Medal of Honor. You know, the reason why he wasn't looked at like that was because Reno was above him in command. And even though Benteen took control for the sake of his men, they all asked, why didn't you go save Custer? Why didn't anybody run towards Custer when they could hear he was obviously engaged and you did nothing? You know, that's the way it was looked at after the battle. And what people were saying, that the blame game was going all over in the 7th Cavalry and the military. But in hindsight, it's like the thing is Frederick Benteen saved probably countless lives. If they would have gone over there, they might have gotten overwhelmed, maybe not. Custer still would have died. There still would have been the last stand. But if Benteen and Reno brought both of their companies over there, you know, it might have gone differently. But in that moment, up here, they decided they were going to stay here and they were not going to go rescue Custer. And then afterwards, Reno mainly went through the biggest problems. This whole thing haunted Reno until his very end. Frederick Benteen had a clear conscience after this, but he was still questioned and kind of blamed for not getting the men to go and save Custer. It was a national hero lost out here in the middle of Montana. In this swale here is where they spent so much time. They spent like the day of the battle, the second day, and then the third, I believe, is when they saw them all taken off. Benteen, Reno, all their companies saw the entire Indian village move out from here, and they watched it, and they gave a heartfelt and tight-throated hurrah, 3 hurrahs for they survived. They realized that the nightmare was probably over. And so they watched the whole band pick up and take off, and they all went down. And it was all from right up here. And all this area here was, in fact, right here, you can see the trenches where the men dug while they were being besieged for about 3 days. And that's the purpose of these trenches up here. And then down in the swale, there's where they set up the medical tent. And all around this perimeter, more than likely, where the sidewalk goes is the actual perimeter of the siege. So you can think about all this whole swale right here was full of 7th Cavalry soldiers with a medical tent down there. There was dead mules and horses, and there was ammo boxes stacked up. There was a view of the battlefield in case the Indians were going to come up the draws, which they kept doing. And from here in this swale, that night after the battle, they could hear the beating of the drums down in the bottom, and there was a huge fire, and the Indians were celebrating that victory from that first day. Up here is where Reno and Benteen actually ended up. Frederick Benteen, they called him the Savior of the South, or Savior of the 7th. And he basically took command from Reno because Reno was just not giving orders. He was not being a good leader, essentially, during this battle. And so Frederick Benteen ends up taking over kind of the entire command because all the soldiers start looking at Benteen like they were confident in him to take command and give orders. Everybody stopped listening to Reno because Reno had done the bad retreat, didn't order them all out safely, basically decided he wanted to leave them all by saying every man for themselves. And up here as well, when Reno and Benteen were discussing things, this is after, I think on the second day, he said he asked Benteen he needed his approval to make it happen, but he wanted to leave the dying and wounded, and escape and make their escape. And Benteen said, "No, we are not going to do that. We are not going to leave the dying and the wounded just to get out of here and save our own skins." So Reno, he knew that with Benteen's approval, that's the only way he could make it happen. So he kind of backed off. But the men kind of got word of that. So the other men that were down here, they all got word that Reno was kind of saying, maybe we should just ditch them, And meanwhile, they're being besieged, and you can see, and the GoPro's not going to pick it up, but there's some actual Indian warrior graves out there as well. We're walking through the Custer National Cemetery. 5,000 service members are buried here, not just from the Little Bighorn, but from wars since 1876 till now. So there's a lot of graves here. A lot of men died for this country. And this is just one. One of these days we'll go to Arlington. Be cool to go see that. And it'd also be cool to go see the West Point Cemetery. That's where Custer's buried. The only person from here, or that died here, that was like really kind of a big deal was Reno. They exhumed Reno because he died of old age, or however he died. He lived his whole life after this whole thing. Went through a dishonorable discharge after all the court proceedings and all that stuff. And in 1967, they reviewed the Battle of the Little Bighorn and decided they reversed Reno's dishonorable discharge and made it an honorable discharge. And so they exhumed his body and buried it here at the Little Bighorn.